Hey everyone, and welcome back to another industry report. And some pretty funny stuff has went down between the guys behind The Last of Us Part 2 and God of War and Jason Schreyer, a games journalist who recently published an exposé into the working conditions of Naughty Dog, who of course are The Last of Us developers. And yeah, look, some of this is a bit of dumb and rather funny Twitter drama, but more importantly, when you actually get into it, it's interesting what these people are saying, what their angles are, and what they're actually not talking about. So much so that this really is an interesting story and it is worth diving into. Now, as always, be sure to like and sub, it helps us out a bunch. And if you'd like to get in on our daily gaming news service, sort of TLDR, the daily briefing, also get access to early videos and a bunch of loot and stuff like that, including the Druid class pin, then check out our Patreon. With that said, let's jump into the story. To kick this off, I've got to be extremely clear about the entire point of this whole endeavor. While this technically is being kicked off by Twitter drama, it does involve the most important leading figures in our industry. I mean, Cory Barlog, right? God of War. Neil Druckmann, The Last of Us Part 2. Jason Schreyer, the one games journo who's out there doing the investigative reporting that's actually bringing really big news instead of the regular just, press release reporting stuff. Like, these are big figures, and when you actually dive into the incentives here, how everyone has pretty much an angle, and some of the glaring things that people are and are not talking about, it actually does bring up a lot of interesting points, and it is very important for us to understand, because this type of thing gives you a little bit of a peer behind the window, into the window of what is going on. That helps us understand things. So, The Last of Us Part 2, right? It got these massively good reviews. Of course, it also got some more dissenting reviews. We've done a video covering that situation. Very interesting indeed, but some of those reviews were, well, extremely praising the game, to the point where one of them was making a bit of a movie analogy. This is the rather amazing and I think a bit silly tagline from a review. In a medium where everything is John Wick, The Last of Us Part 2 is Schindler's List. Which, I mean, look, using film analogies to make, for games, to try to make games seem like a more valid form of art, that is something that I think we're just about all pretty darn tired of. Also, it just doesn't really make any sense as a comparison, and really, if you were to use any comparison, I really think Schindler's List would be the one that you would use if you were going for specificity here. And, of course, then, this is The Last of Us Part 2. It's a game that many people will see as a movie game, so something like this pairs up with that in a way that's maybe not ideal. Then add into this that Schindler's List was, of course, about an extremely just terrible, damaging event in human history, and well, that obviously does ratchet up some of the drama and some of people's responses to this, as we will see later on in this video. Now, this discourse is something that definitely started off on the wrong foot, and basically, with that review, a bunch of people ended up dunking on it, making fun of it, and that did include Jason Schreyer, who is one of the leading journalists in the games industry. Now, what Jason said prompted responses from Neil Druckmann and Cory Barlog, two extremely big, let's just call them PS boys, studio director type guys, and it actually does expose some very interesting things, especially when you see the two of them try to gang up on Jason Schreyer, the guy who did a big investigative report that really did slam the working practices of one of their studios, but then also calls into question some of what Jason's doing, and it's a very interesting situation. So, in response to that review, obviously Twitter users did what Twitter users did best. They made fun of it, and some of the people making fun of it are, guess what? Pretty funny. And you know what? To be fair to him, Jason Schreier's contribution was also pretty funny. He said, see, BioShock's audio logs are a lot like the diary of Anne Frank, which, I mean, is an absurd thing to say on purpose. That's the kind of the point of his joke. And you know what? I think it's a funny comparison, and I kind of get what Jason's getting at, and I basically do agree, because like Jason, I thought that, it was a bit of a dumb tagline from a review. But in essence, this is people making fun of the comparisons that people draw between video games and between other mediums like films and books, sometimes in an effort to try to legitimize games, but in a way that I think is particularly, outside, right? It seems a little bit judgmental of the video game, since a lot of other mediums don't really have to struggle whether people think they're legitimate or not. So that's basically what happened, right? Jason made fun of it, and also as somebody who had lost family members in Auschwitz, he was not particularly pleased with the hyperbole in that particular reference. Now, Neil Druckmann, of course, responded there, trying to diffuse, saying he doesn't want to pick a fight, but he does want to avoid any escalation of claims of anti-Semitism. And it seems a bit preemptive of him, but you certainly would not want that type of feeling that type of drama hanging over your game's launch. But really, this is something that should have been a mild incident, but then it's the spectacular breakdown of communication and pettiness that is basically revealing. And I think sometimes if you give people the freedom to talk without really much consequence, what happens there? It reveals. And we have to analyze what it reveals and have a chat about it. So, anyway, the drama begins with Neil tweeting a screenshot of the criticism of that review, including Jason's tweet. And Neil says, "With all due respect, I find these kind of ironic jokes to be unproductive at best. We can do better with critical discourse, especially by those of us with thousands of followers, and especially about sensitive subject matter." So with this, it's clear that either misses why these jokes are being made in the first place, or maybe has a bit of a different view on, legitimizing of games as art via the comparison to films. Maybe that is the case, and you could certainly make that argument given some of the content that he has worked on, but then also you could read this as him trying to use the anti-Semitism angle to ward off criticism. Now, to that, Jason responded pretty quickly. He said that it's weirdly personal. And Jason said that, well, Neil's gone after him multiple times, and Jason suggested that yes, this may indeed be because of Jason's reporting on Naughty Dog's working conditions, the treatment of staff, and some of the reportedly very bad ways that Naughty Dog have ran their company. And, while I think we could all see why Neil would be quite upset by something like that, he does kind of come across like he's playing the victim here. But of course, there is some escalation because the Barlog enters. So, to the escalation, Schreyer accuses Neil of being personal over his reporting, right? That Neil is just salty that Jason has been doing investigative journalism into his company. And then Cory Barlog, the God of War director, steps in, saying, "I have to say that lately you come across as a bit of a bully, Jason." He goes as far as to say, "I get that your bread and butter is tearing us down." And honestly, it's the lines like that that are the reason why I decided to make this video, because this is where the, subclasses of people within the industry, it's where the divisions become clear, it's where the sides become clear, and that is where it gets interesting. Because this is indicative of how Cory Barlog sees Jason Schreier's work, at least in that moment when he made that tweet. And that implies understanding that Cory belongs to the group of people that are causing those issues within the industry that, of course, Jason is then reporting. And this actually reinforces Jason's stance as the enemy of, these guys in power, these PS boys with big studios that Jason maybe is going to be writing articles about. So, Jason very much pulled the gloves off in his next tweet, saying, "If by us you mean people in power who facilitate the overwork and exploitation of labor, then sure. And if by us you mean game developers, then that's nonsense, and we both know it." And it's an interesting thing. I mean, look, even within the indie companies that I know of one company that mandates zero overtime pay for their staff, and also in their contract mandates that the company will expect them to work overtime if it is needed. And let's just say I've heard the CEO of that company's response to his employees grilling him on that, and suffice to say it came up severely lacking, saying, we can't pay you overtime because somebody could exploit it. Sounds like a way to exploit some labor there. So, look, even if Jason can be a bit of an asshole sometimes on the old twitter.com, what he's talking about is a real problem. I mean, especially there's cases like the one that I just referenced that, you'll probably never know about that studio, but, that's one that routinely boasts about how good it is, and then you see they do the actual complete opposite when it's behind closed doors. And that is something that is surprisingly prevalent within the industry, and that's why journalism is a pretty darn good thing to have around. Now, Cory de-escalates this a bit by saying that he agrees with Jason, and he affirms that Jason's investigative work is good, but he says that Jason is still coming across as being mean. So, yep, it's a bunch of grown men having an unprofessional and immature fight on twitter.com, everyone's favorite website, basically bumping chests and making an already fiery situation worse. Look, it's pretty mild, all things considered here, but I think what's very clear to us here is that there's this us versus them thing going on. Developers versus journalists versus gamers, with these fragile alliances, sort of ad hoc things forming on Twitter when the mocking happens and when this stuff ends up going on. And obviously breaking this down into factions is an extremely reductive thing, but you can basically see the broad groups of people at each other's throats all the time. And this is where we kind of get into more parts of this video that I think have got the actual quality content, when it's talking about incentives, right? And what is the angle of all these people? What are they looking to hide? Why did it go down like this? Now, there are a few other things, like there was one example, and this was super interesting to me because it was a hell of a subtweet. Jason tweeted that he was digging into a story only for a studio head to tell the staff of that studio that the studio head knew people at Kotaku, and then would be able to know if any of their staff had talked to Kotaku. So basically, that was, studio head threatening staff for talking to the press. Now, the thing is, he kind of just dropped that tweet there. Does he mean Corey? Does he mean Neil? Does he mean someone else? Who the hell knows, but it certainly was something for him to drop in, and I suppose it is a little bit of an indication as to some of what happens when the people in power in the industry get to, well, wield that power, and the staff kind of end up feeling like they don't really have much they can do. So, with that said, let's go and let's talk about incentives. So, Neil here, what is he doing? He's trying to keep his game launch to be as smooth as it possibly can be, and that is despite having almost everything go wrong that could have went wrong, except for the review scores. I mean, come on, it's been ridiculous with the leaks and all of that stuff. You could not have a worse launch. Now, his incentives here, I think, are obvious but limited. He is basically getting hammered with criticism. Some of that is personal, saying that a lot of people are basically saying that he, took big control of the project, ruined the game, took it away from where the people who cared about the characters would have wanted, and, taking that sort of criticism can't be easy if you're also the guy who's sort of in charge of $1 billion IP and you've got your personal mark on it. Now, he's overall not doing a bad job, all things considered, but there is a bit of a subtlety in who he's signal boosting. Like, he retweeted Skill Up in a positive way. Now, Skill Up, as we covered, did not enjoy the game, but he did say that the high review scores are not being paid for. And to join in on that bit of discussion, I also don't think that the high review scores are literally being paid for. I don't think that's happening at all. I think that is a little bit conspiratorial, but I do think there are some other explanations, right? There are huge swathes of reasons as to these big scores. A low score, well, that could make sure that a publisher doesn't invite you to the next event, and that could hurt your bottom line if you're all about getting those clicks. Access is everything in an industry like this, and yeah, obviously, if you start giving, 5 out of 10s, a publisher is going to be like, well, that's just going to take our Metacritic down. We don't want that. So in that situation, not having an early copy of Sony or Naughty Dog's next blockbuster, that could result in a lot of lost traffic, and there are publishers who are on the record with behavior like that in the past. And come on, IGN's notoriously high scores are a laughingstock for that reason. Do I think they're literally paid off to give good reviews? No. But do I think that IGN sometimes kind of think like, yeah, if we're too critical here, then when we do our next big event, maybe we'll lose this publisher as a partner? Now, I'm not saying that is the case. That is my personal opinion, of course. People, though, inherently, I think, do understand that sometimes the wheels need to be greased up, and I think that is an aspect in these reviews. There then are other factors here, right? And I think one of them for those high reviews is really a cultural expectation that binds certain profiles of reviewers together. And I think that's why Skill Up, I think coming from a far more audience-driven perspective, will have thought some of those things, whereas maybe some of the more art critic angles will have seen some of this game as being particularly daring in what it was doing, right? There's reviews praising how the game is not fun, and there's reviews praising how the reviewer could barely stick playing through it. And it's like, yeah, if you're saying that, then man, you are going at this maybe from a different perspective than many audience members. But I think there is an incentive sometimes to sound very smart, right? To sound like you are having the very educated take. And I think there is a lot of banding together that happens with the reviewers that leads to not a massive amount of divergent opinions when it comes to massive cultural touchstone events such as this one. And I think that is something you have seen across the reviews of many different controversial things in the last few years. Overall, though, Neil is clearly knee-deep in all of this stuff, and with so much riding in the line, the more negative ideas that he can dispel out there, then the better he is going to feel. And if he can delegitimize both criticism and Jason Schreyer, and therefore some of his reporting, in one fell swoop, then that's an exceptional move for him to make if he can pull it off. And then there is just the fact that, Neil hasn't really responded properly to what has been said about the working practices of the studio that he's heading up, right? Well, I guess he's major in this project is my point. He's not responded to that. Sony haven't really responded to that. We've just not really seen anything that's meeting that criticism. And that's why just about any time he posts something, you're saying, you look at the comments and it's people saying, yeah, but what about the working conditions? Are you being terrible to your staff? I think that's an angle there. Now, when you move on to Jason's side of things and the journalist side of things for him, Well, look, Jason's being Jason, right? I think he's getting a bit caught up in his work. I think, maybe, look, it also could be that he's heard things about Naughty Dog that he cannot reveal. And I think maybe his hostility could come from that. Or maybe Jason has framed himself as the moral arbiter, destined to take them down for their sins. And certainly as a journalist, his work is pretty targeted. Not to bring in political discussion here, but I would assume that this is something that Jason himself would self-identify as, but, he's not the biggest fan of how the old capitalism is playing out, right? He's not a big fan of that. He believes it should be illegal for someone to be a billionaire, right? So I guess that would mean that if you had a company, and that company was raising in a value such as your shares in that company would exceed $1 billion in value, maybe Jason's plan would be that you would have an automated stock share off to the government or something. Not quite sure, but, that's the angle that he's coming from. That's a lot of his focus, right? Now, that does mean that he talks about workers' rights, people being, taken for a ride. And I've got plenty of my own examples from just, being around the industry. You see bad stuff going on. It's definitely happening. Jason's pointing that out in some of the biggest companies that are the hardest to access. And that is positive and important work. And he absolutely does put himself and his sources on the line when it comes to reporting the exploitation of labor. And that's a situation where, the industry seems to be pretty darn bad. However, it seems, though, that his efforts there are getting very much tied into his identity, right? And I do think that he is prone to coming off as a bit of a self-righteous sort of dude, and I think that rubs people the wrong way. Now, based on the last few tweets there, he clearly sees himself as the enemy of the big studios, and I mean, in fairness, based on what some of Kotaku posted in the past, of course he's no longer working there, but Kotaku actually was the enemy of many big publishers. They were on so many blacklists, I think including Ubisoft as an example, but I think Jason sees himself as the enemy, so when Corey calls Jason mean, he's kind of right. Jason's bullishness on Twitter certainly seems to be amping up. He seems to be a lot more fired up to really go at these guys. Now, to be fair, Twitter users in general have just gone off the deep end thanks to 2020, and it can be rather funny sometimes, but still, I think that's no excuse. It might be one of the most entertaining websites on the internet, and it's incredible that Twitter's for free. I mean, wow, some of the funny stuff that happens there, it's almost like it would be worth paying for, but allowing people to freely communicate in only a few characters as tensions are running high, well, it certainly is resulting in a bunch of conflict, and a bunch of conflict that's quite interesting for us. It's fun to watch and understand the fundamentals of, and I suppose it can give us little glimpses into what's going on. Overall here, I'm just left thinking throughout all of this, what about the workers? Why has that not been addressed by anybody? Why? I mean, other than Jason, of course. But, why is Corey saying that he totally agrees with Jason's work, reading into, doing the investigative reporting into Naughty Dog, right? Corey's saying he agrees with that. And I'm like, well, okay, but you've not really said anything about the article on the guy you just defended and the studio that he's at. So what's going on there? Why has nobody talked about this? Is this a situation actually where Jason Schreyer has, handpicked his sources? And he's got enough to go with for the article he wants to write, even though it's maybe not the article to write that's the most fair and balanced. Is that the case? Or is Jason actually spot on with his article, and we're in a situation where these working conditions are just not really being addressed by anybody with power? That is where I am left with this, and I think that exploring this whole just total embarrassing meltdown of communication between everybody involved that just made everyone look like a big child, I think that's where it gets interesting, right? And you're kind of thinking, well, there's a lot of, supposedly, right, there's a lot of workers at Naughty Dog who have not had a particularly great time, who have been in uncomfortable positions, have been sort of pushed beyond what you would say is reasonable. Well, what does it feel like for those people to then have, the studio head kind of go a bit silent on it, not really talk about it, then start going after the guy who tried to report on that, and then you feel like, oh, Cory Barlog, right, so the other big PS boys came in to sort of double down, defend that. Okay, what's going on here? That's the sort of stuff I'm wanting to work out. And I suppose for me, what I really want to know is how in line with reality is Schreyer's article? Is that the common perception on the ground at that company, or did he just have enough people who were willing to talk, who thought what they thought, that he maybe even got an unbalanced picture of what was going on? And I suppose that's the thing. It all does come back to how much you trust him as a journalist. And that's pretty much the situation here. So I suppose overall, how I'd want to end this video is on a few different things. I would really like to know, what do you think of films versus video games, right? Those comparisons. What do you think about that? And then when you actually look into what unfolded here, what do you think about Schreyer's reporting? Do you think that that article on Naughty Dog was accurate? And then when we go to Druckmann and Barlog's responses, what do you think about those? Do those guys have something to hide? Are they conveniently not talking about what's going on at their studios, even though we have an investigative report that is saying that at least one of those studios has got severe problems? And then, of course, many ex-staff talking about that article as well. What do you think's going on? And I suppose there's also the other angle of this, that is, do you care? Does this matter to you as a customer, right? Do you care how the sausage is made? I'd be very interested to know how many people think that, and I suppose at what level that is thought. Because there is a bit of, well, look, I just want to put my $60 into a good product. I don't really care how it got to me. I just want a good value proposition as a customer, right? There's going to be that. But then I would say there's maybe the second order effects of those issues. So yes, you might still get your $60 product, but maybe in another timeline where those deep structural problems were not happening, it would have came out to you years earlier and with better quality. So that's the other sort of angle here, where I think that the downsides of these things happening in the industry are not literally felt in some, they're felt in things like Anthem, but they're not literally felt a lot of the time. It's more just the missed opportunity. So let me know what you think about those things. I hope you found this to at least be an interesting discussion, or hey, maybe even just a little bit funny. So let me know. Thank you for listening in, and I will see you next time.